Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're diving deep into Skin in the Game by Nassim Nicholas Taleb.
Oh, yeah, Taleb. He's always stirring things up.
Yeah, he definitely keeps things interesting.
But you know what I like about him? Underneath that kind of in-your-face style, there's real wisdom there
I agree.
about risk and responsibility and how the world actually works.
Okay, so for those of our listeners who haven't read Skin in the Game yet, what's the core idea?
Well, at its heart, it's the idea that when you make a decision and you've got something to lose, it leads to better outcomes. Not just for you, but for everybody involved.
So you're saying it's about more than just financial risk?
Yeah, it's way more than just money. It's about aligning incentives so that people are motivated to act in a way that benefits everyone.
Okay.
You know, the collective good. And Taleb argues that this is like a fundamental principle. It's everywhere. You see it in ancient legal codes, modern markets, ethics, religion, even our personal lives.
Wow, that's a pretty broad scope. Before we get into the specifics, can you give us a quick overview of the main themes Taleb explores in the book?
Absolutely. One of the big ones is symmetry and reciprocity. The idea that those who reap the rewards should also bear the risks.
Makes sense.
He's also really critical of risk transfer, you know, where those making decisions can avoid the consequences of their actions, often at the expense of others. Think about the 2008 financial crisis.
Oof. Yeah, a lot of people felt that one.
Exactly. He also dives into the power of minority rule, how small groups can impose their will on the majority. It's pretty counterintuitive.
Okay, I'm into it.
And then there's the Lindy effect. The idea that what's been around for a long time is likely to last even longer. He applies that to everything. Ideas, technology, social institutions, you name it.
Fascinating. And we can't forget his critique of the intellectual yet idiot.
Oh, yeah, the IYI. He doesn't hold back.
No, he does not.
The IYI is intelligent but totally detached from reality,
Right.
always advocating for these complex solutions without considering the practical consequences.
Sounds like it's going to be a wild ride. So for our deep dive today, let's focus on the main text and start from the beginning.
Sounds good to me.
All right, so Taleb kicks things off with the concept of skin in the game through these historical examples and thought experiments. He contrasts the ancient world where consequences were immediate and severe with modern society where people can make decisions that impact others without facing any personal repercussions.
Big difference.
Yeah, for sure. He brings up Hammurabi's code, a set of Babylonian laws from almost 4,000 years ago.
Wow.
And it mandated that if a builder built a house and it collapsed and killed the owner, the builder would be put to death too.
Wow. That's pretty drastic.
It is, but it shows his point perfectly. This kind of symmetry ensured accountability. It meant that those who made decisions had a strong incentive to make sure they were good ones.
I see. So how does that principle apply to the modern world?
Well, Taleb argues that we've moved away from that kind of direct accountability. We have all these layers of bureaucracy, complex systems.
And often a disconnect between those who make the decisions and those who bear the consequences. He's especially critical of what he calls interventionistas, people who meddle in complex systems without any real understanding of how they work or any skin in the game if things go wrong.
Can you give us some examples?
Think about politicians who start wars but don't send their own children to fight, or economists who advocate for policies that could wreck the economy but don't face any personal financial repercussions if they're wrong.
Right. They benefit from the upside while others bear the downside risk.
Exactly. And Taleb argues that this kind of asymmetry, it's not only unfair, it's dangerous.
Yeah.
It leads to bad decisions, systemic fragility, and a loss of trust in institutions.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of Taleb's most famous passages, the Bob Rubin trade, right?
Yes. He uses that term to describe when someone gets paid a huge bonus for making risky bets that pay off in the short term but faces no penalty if those bets go sour in the long term and cause widespread damage. It's classic risk transfer.
Okay, so we've established that skin in the game is important for accountability and making better decisions. But how does this principle play out in more everyday situations?
Well, Taleb argues it applies to all sorts of transactions and interactions. He uses the example of a merchant selling corn in ancient roads. This merchant knows that other ships are on their way with similar cargo, which could drive down the price of corn.
So does he have a moral obligation to disclose that information to potential buyers?
That's exactly the question Taleb poses. It gets to the heart of ethics and fairness and information asymmetry. He argues that true fairness requires both parties to have a similar level of uncertainty when entering into a transaction. In other words, both sides should have skin in the game.
So levels of the playing field.
Right. And he draws a parallel to modern markets where we have things like insider trading, deceptive marketing, hidden fees.
Right.
All of those create an imbalance of information and risk. It's a case for greater transparency and for being wary of those who try to profit by obscuring information or shifting risk onto others.
So it's a reminder that buyer beware isn't always enough. We need to be aware of the hidden asymmetries in our transactions and interactions.
Absolutely. And that leads us to another interesting concept, the minority rule. Now, it might seem counterintuitive, but Taleb argues that a small but really stubborn minority can often impose its preferences on the majority.
This is where it gets really interesting. How does that work?
Well, think about it this way. Let's say you have a group of people trying to decide on a restaurant, and even one person in that group is completely unwilling to eat at a certain type of place. The entire group might end up going somewhere else just to accommodate that one person.
Oh, I see what you mean.
The majority might prefer Italian, but if one person refuses to eat pasta, they might all end up at a steakhouse.
That's a great example. I can see how that plays out in everyday life.
Exactly. And this dynamic can have a huge impact on everything, from the spread of ideas and cultural norms to the success of businesses and political movements. Taleb argues that understanding the power of the minority rule is essential for anyone who wants to make a difference in the world.
So it's not always about convincing the majority. Sometimes it's about finding and mobilizing a committed minority.
You got it. Think about social change movements throughout history. They often start with a small group of passionate individuals who refuse to compromise on their beliefs. And eventually, their persistence starts to influence the larger society.
That's incredibly inspiring. It's a reminder that change is possible, even if it seems like you're going against the grain.
Definitely. Speaking of going against the grain, Taleb doesn't hold back when criticizing those he sees as out of touch with reality, especially the intellectual yet idiot or IYIs.
IYI, he really goes after them in this book.
He does. He describes the IYI as someone who's intelligent but lacked practical wisdom and common sense. They often live in this bubble of abstract ideas and theories totally detached from the real-world consequences of their actions.
So what are some of the telltale signs of an IYI?
Well, they tend to love complexity just for the sake of complexity. They're often obsessed with credentials and status. They are very vocal about their opinions, even if they haven't actually done anything to back them up.
And they're often prone to virtue signaling, making a big show of their moral superiority without actually taking any meaningful action.
So all talk and no action.
Pretty much. And old Taleb argues that they can be incredibly dangerous because they often hold positions of power and influence. Yet their decisions are based on abstract theories and ideologies rather than practical experience and an understanding of how the world really works.
So how do we avoid becoming IYIs ourselves?
It's all about staying grounded, questioning our assumptions, and being willing to learn from our mistakes. We need to be wary of getting caught up in abstract theories that don't align with reality. And we need to be willing to test our ideas in the real world, even if it means risking failure.
So it's a call to humility and intellectual honesty.
Absolutely. So we've talked about the importance of having skin in the game for accountability, fairness, and decision-making. We've also explored the power of the minority rule and the dangers of the IYI. Where does Taleb go from here?
Yeah, where do we go from here?
Well, next he dives into a fascinating discussion of inequality.
But not in the way you might expect. He distinguishes between what he calls static and dynamic inequality.
Static versus dynamic.
Yes, static inequality is like a snapshot of wealth distribution at a particular moment in time. Dynamic inequality considers how people move up and down the economic ladder over time.
So it's not just about how much wealth people have, but about their ability to change their circumstances.
You got it. Taleb argues that just focusing on static inequality can be misleading. It's more important to look at whether people have opportunities to improve their situation and whether the system allows for social mobility.
That makes sense. So what does he say about how people actually experience inequality?
Well, he introduces this fascinating idea of cobbler envies cobbler.
Cobbler envies cobbler.
Yeah, it means that people are more likely to envy those who are similar to them in social standing than those who are vastly richer or poorer. He uses the example of a cobbler who's more likely to be envious of another cobbler who's slightly more successful than he is than a king or a billionaire.
That's an interesting observation.
It is. It speaks to human psychology. We tend to compare ourselves to those who are in our immediate social circle, and we tend to be more sensitive to small differences in status within our peer group than to large differences between ourselves and people who are far removed from our everyday lives.
Yeah, because it makes sense. We're constantly interacting with people who are on a similar level to ourselves, so those comparisons are more salient.
Exactly. And that leads to another fascinating concept, vertical socialization. Taleb argues that people are less envious of those they interact with directly, even if those individuals are significantly wealthier.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Imagine you have a close friend who becomes very wealthy. You're likely to be happy for them, even if you haven't experienced the same level of financial success.
Okay.
Why? Because you have a personal relationship with them, you see their character, their work ethic, the sacrifices they've made.
So it's about personal connection overcoming those feelings of envy.
Exactly. Vertical socialization creates a sense of shared experience and understanding that transcends economic disparities.
That's a really hopeful thought. It suggests that even in a world with significant economic inequality, we can still find ways to connect with each other and build meaningful relationships across those divides.
I think that's one of the most important takeaways from Taleb's work. He's not denying the existence of inequality, but he's challenging us to think about it in a more nuanced way and to focus on creating a society that fosters social mobility and opportunities for everyone.
This has been an incredible start to our deep dive into skin in the game. We've covered so much ground already, but there's still so much more to explore.
I know, right? And it's only going to get more interesting from here. Buckle up.
I'm ready for the ride.
It's amazing how he ties all these different ideas together,
Yeah.
from ancient law to modern finance to, social dynamics and how it all comes back to skin in the game.
Yeah, it's like he's weaving a tapestry showing how this one principle operates on so many different levels.
Exactly. And he's not afraid to shake things up a bit either.
Speaking of shaking things up, let's talk about the Lindy effect. What is it, and why is it so important to Taleb?
Well, the Lindy effect is this idea that the longer something's been around, the longer it's likely to stick around.
So the things that have stood the test of time are more likely to last.
Exactly. It's like survival of the fittest, but for ideas, technology, social institutions. Think about ancient wisdom compared to like trendy diets or time-tested recipes versus experimental cuisine.
Okay.
Those things that have been around for centuries, they have this kind of robustness to them.
Yeah, they've proven their value.
Right. And this has huge implications for how we evaluate information, make decisions, even how we build our lives.
Right.
In a world where there's so much information constantly bombarding us with new ideas and trends,
Right.
the Lindy effect can be a powerful tool for figuring out what's really valuable and what's just going to fade away.
So how can we apply the Lindy effect in our own lives?
Taleb suggests that we should be wary of things that are new, flashy, overly complex. Instead, we should look for things that have a track record of success. Things that have stood the test of time and have proven their worth through actual practice. Not just theory.
So it's about looking for time-tested wisdom instead of chasing the latest fads.
Yeah. And it's also about being skeptical of so-called experts who don't have a track record of success.
Yeah.
Just because someone has a fancy degree or a ton of followers on social media doesn't mean they actually know what they're talking about.
So look for people who have actually done the things they're talking about.
Exactly. Look for people who have skin in the game.
Right. People who have something to lose.
Right. They're the ones who are more likely to make decisions that benefit everyone, not just themselves.
So we've talked about accountability, fairness, decision-making, the power of minority rule, the dangers of the IYI, and the importance of the Lindy effect. What other key insights does Taleb offer in Skin in the Game?
He talks about this idea of anti-fragility, things that actually benefit from stressors and volatility.
Wait, benefit from stress? That seems kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah, I know, right? But think about the human body for a second.
Okay.
When you expose it to stress, like exercise or fasting, it actually gets stronger and more resilient.
So it's not just about withstanding stress, but actually thriving on it.
Exactly. And Taleb says this applies to all kinds of systems, businesses, economies, political systems, even personal relationships.
Can you give us some examples of anti-fragility in action?
Sure. Think about the restaurant industry.
Oh, yeah.
A restaurant that's always adapting to changing tastes, experimenting with new dishes and getting feedback from customers is more likely to survive than one that's stuck in its ways and afraid to take risks.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And Taleb says we should embrace a little bit of disorder in our lives. Instead of trying to control everything and avoid risk, we should look for opportunities to challenge ourselves. Experiment, learn from our mistakes.
So become more comfortable with uncertainty and volatility.
Right. And build systems and institutions that are designed to be anti-fragile, ones that can adapt and evolve when things change.
That's a powerful idea. especially in today's world where everything's changing so rapidly.
It is, and it has implications for everything, from how we design our cities to how we educate our children.
So how can we cultivate anti-fragility in our own lives?
Well, Taleb suggests a few things. First, be willing to take risks. I don't mean be reckless, but step outside your comfort zone a little bit.
Okay.
Second, embrace failure as a learning opportunity. You know, don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's how you learn and grow.
Right.
And third, build redundancy into your life. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Diversify your investments, your skills, your relationships.
It sounds like a recipe for a more resilient and fulfilling life.
I think so too. It's a really important message in a world that's getting more complex and unpredictable all the time.
Taleb also has some interesting things to say about wealth, doesn't he?
He does, and he might surprise you. He argues that real wealth isn't just about money, it's about freedom and control over your own time and choices.
So it's not about how much you have, but how you live.
Exactly. He makes a distinction between having money and being wealthy. You know, having money can trap you in this cycle of consumerism and status seeking. True wealth allows you to live a life of meaning and purpose on your own terms.
So it's about having the freedom to pursue your passions, spend time with loved ones, and contribute to the world in a way that's meaningful to you.
Exactly. And Taleb says this kind of wealth is often more attainable than we think. It's not about winning the lottery. It's about making conscious choices about how we spend our time, our money, our energy.
So living intentionally.
Right. And recognizing that true wealth isn't something you buy. It's something you cultivate.
That's a really empowering message.
Yeah.
It suggests that we all have the potential to create a life of wealth and abundance, regardless of our financial situation.
I think that's one of the key takeaways from his work. He's challenging us to redefine what it means to be wealthy and to focus on building a life that's truly meaningful and fulfilling.
So we've talked about accountability, fairness, decision-making, the power of minority rule, the dangers of the IYI, the importance of the Lindy effect, the concept of anti-fragility, and a new perspective on wealth. What other themes does Taleb explore in Skin in the Game?
He also talks about this idea of soul in the game.
Soul in the game.
Yeah, it goes even deeper than just having skin in the game. It's about having a deep commitment to your craft, your values, the well-being of others. It's about finding meaning and purpose in what you do.
So it's not just about self-interest.
No, it's about more than that.
Right.
He uses the example of artisans who take pride in their work, even if it means sacrificing financial gain for quality and craftsmanship.
They're not just in it for the money.
Exactly. They care about what they're creating and the impact it has on others. And Taleb argues that soul in the game is essential for true success, both personally and professionally.
It's about aligning your actions with your values and finding fulfillment in the process, not just the outcome.
Right. It's about doing work that matter.
Work that makes a difference.
Exactly. And he says that's something we should all strive for.
It's a beautiful idea, especially in a world where so much work feels meaningless and disconnected from any larger purpose.
It is. It's a reminder that we have a choice. We can choose to work for companies and organizations that are aligned with our values, or we can create our own work that allows us to express our creativity and make a positive impact.
So taking ownership of our work and finding ways to make it meaningful.
Exactly. And recognizing that true success isn't just about money, it's about living a life of purpose and fulfillment.
This has been such an insightful conversation. We've covered so much ground, from the importance of skin in the game to the power of anti-fragility to the search for soul in our work.
It's been great.
And I think it's amazing how Taleb connects all these ideas together. You know, it's really thought-provoking.
He's brilliant.
He really is. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some key takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember?
I think the biggest one is that skin in the game is about more than just financial risk. It's about taking responsibility for our actions, aligning our incentives with our values, and creating a world where those who make decisions actually bear the consequences of those decisions.
Building a more just efficient and resilient society.
Exactly. And living a life of integrity, courage, and purpose. A life where we're not afraid to take risks, challenge the status quo, and fight for what we believe in.
I think that's a great place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground in this episode, and there's still so much more to explore. We'll be back in part 3 to continue our deep dive into Skin in the Game.
I can't wait.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Skin in the Game. We've covered so much ground already. It's really amazing how Taleb brings all these ideas together.
It is right. It
It's
makes you look at the world in a whole new way.
Definitely. So as we wrap things up, what are some of the key takeaways you want our listeners to remember from Skin in the Game?
I think one of the biggest ones is to be careful about who you take advice from. You know,
Yeah.
especially those who don't face any consequences if their advice turns out to be bad.
So look for people who have skin in the game.
Exactly. People who are willing to put their money where their mouth is, they're the ones you can trust.
Actions speak louder than words, right?
Absolutely.
Hmm.
And along the same lines, Taleb says we should be skeptical of those who act like they have all the answers.
Right, like they know everything.
Yeah, but they've never actually experienced the things they're talking about. It's all theoretical.
He calls them interventionistas, right?
Yes.
Those who meddle in things they don't understand. And then when things go wrong, they don't suffer any consequences.
Like politicians who start wars but don't send their own kids to fight.
Exactly. Or economists who push policies that could wreck the economy. But if they're wrong, no skin off their nose.
It's a recipe for disaster.
It really is. And it's everywhere if you start looking for it.
So how do we protect ourselves from these interventionistas?
Well, Taleb says it comes down to judgment. We have to learn to trust the right people. But how do you do that? There's so much information out there, so many opinions. It's hard to know who to believe.
One tool Taleb gives us is the Lindy effect.
Oh, right. The idea that the longer something has survived, the more likely it is to keep surviving.
Exactly. It helps you filter out the noise.
Yeah.
So when you come across a new idea or a new technology or even just a new piece of advice, ask yourself, has this stood the test of time? If it has, it's probably worth paying attention to. If not, be careful.
That's really useful.
Hmm.
Are there other things we can do to improve our judgment?
Definitely. Experience is key. Nothing beats getting your hands dirty, making mistakes, and learning from them, you know?
Getting out there in the real world.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to challenge your own beliefs, even if it means being wrong sometimes.
So be humble, be curious,
Yeah.
and be open to new information.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to step outside your comfort zone a little bit. Take some risks. Experiment. You never know what you might learn.
That reminds me of Taleb's idea of anti-fragility.
Right. The idea that some things actually get stronger when they're exposed to stress and volatility.
It's like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Exactly. And Taleb says we can apply that to our own lives. Embrace a little bit of chaos, take some calculated risks, build some redundancy into your systems, and you'll be more resilient in the long run.
Instead of trying to control everything and avoid all risk.
Right. Shift your mindset from fragility to resilience. It's a game changer.
I love it. This has been such an eye-opening conversation.
You too?
I feel like skin in the game has given me a whole new toolkit for dealing with life's complexities.
I think that's one of the best things about this book. It's not just about theory. It's about practical wisdom. It's about living a better life.
It really is. Well, I think that about wraps up our deep dive into skin in the game. It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
The pleasure was all mine.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. I hope you found this deep dive as insightful and thought-provoking as we did. And remember, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeking out those who truly have skin in the game.